At the height of World War I, the film opens in the bleak trenches of France. Military dog Stubby sprints across the battlefield as deadly bombs go off all around him. He scans the area and discovers a wounded soldier. He immediately barks for assistance. When the soldier's fellow soldiers hear this, they rush to save him and quickly carry the wounded man to a hospital. After reaching camp, the soldiers wonder how a dog made it to the front lines of the conflict as word of Stubby's brave act spreads throughout the trenches. Then, a flashback takes place to Stubby's adventures start 6 months earlier in a small Connecticut town. A starving Stubby wanders the town one sunny afternoon in search of food. He stumbles upon a parade of recruits marching through the town's streets after several minutes of searching. One of the marching soldiers, Robert, decides to throw a cookie at Stubby as the parade goes on after noticing that he is hungry. Stubby quickly downs the cookie, starving. He then rushes after the parade in the hope of running into Robert. Stubby is redirected by the guarding officers before he can reach the sympathetic soldier as the troops enter their training camp. The stray dog is persistent and doesn't give up, instead figuring out a different way through the broken camp fence. He rushes inside and collides with Robert. Upon seeing him, the soldier is immediately startled and tries to shoo Stubby away. The stray dog, though, is incredibly persistent and refuses to go away. Robert finally gives up after numerous unsuccessful attempts and decides to keep the stray as a pet. Stubby joins the soldiers' training regimen over the following few months as he helps Robert overcome his daily obstacles. Robert spends every night training Stubby and teaching him various dog tricks during this time, and the two develop a close bond. Robert and the rest of the army troops are sent to France to fight alongside the French army after their training is complete. The young soldier is devastated to hear the news because he can't bring Stubby with him. Robert finally has to say his goodbyes and gives his new friend a dog tag as a parting gift after having no other option. He then gives Stubby to the camp's cook to be kept safe. That evening, as the officers depart for deployment, Stubby breaks free of his leash and pursues the platoon. He follows the men using his keen sense of smell to a nearby station, where he finds them just as the train is about to depart. Stubby relentlessly pursues the moving car in an effort to find Robert again. Fortunately, he catches up to it just in time to jump onto it. A seaport is where the train eventually stops an hour or so later as the soldiers enter a military ship that has been provided. Stubby considers joining the marching troops, but changes his mind after spotting 2 soldiers standing watch. As the unaware soldiers unknowingly offload him on the ship, the cunning dog stealthily hides in one of the ship's cargoes to avoid being caught. Stubby patiently awaits the ship's departure that evening. He then emerges from the covered cargo and sets off in search of Robert. He encounters a guard patrolling the deck while exploring the ship, but manages to hide before being seen, narrowly avoiding being apprehended. After some searching, Stubby eventually locates the sleeping soldiers in one of the ship's cabins. Stubby uses his keen senses to find Robert and leaps on the sleeping soldier, giving him an enthusiastic hug. Robert is absolutely shocked to see Stubby on the ship, but he immediately starts to worry for the dog's safety because he might be thrown overboard if anyone finds out. As a result, Robert enlists the assistance of his 2 friends Hans and Olsen to hide Stubby. The trio moves covertly through the ship in search of a place to hide. Unfortunately, their covert operation fails when they encounter the lieutenant of their platoon, who ends up spotting Stubby. When Stubby is discovered, the 3 soldiers quake in fear for his survival. However, much to their shock, the lieutenant likes Stubby and lets him stay on the ship. The troops finally touch down on land after several weeks and proceed on foot to their designated location. The American soldiers proceed to a huge trench where a platoon of French soldiers had set up camp and made their way there to spend the night. The following morning, the enemy lines launch a barrage of bomb blasts to welcome the new troops. All of the soldiers quickly fled for cover, but sadly, a couple of French soldiers were hurt by the frenzied attack. Stubby, on the other hand, escapes unharmed because of Robert's care. Stubby leaps into action after the attack is over and rescues a wounded soldier who was buried under exploded debris. The shrewd dog then warns the paramedics, who rush to save the soldier's life by rushing to his aid. The following day, Robert is partnered with a Frenchman named Gaston to go on a reconnaissance mission. Together, the two ride a pair of horses as they move toward a hill behind enemy lines to spy on the Germans with Stubby. They reach their destination a short while later and quietly scan the enemy troops through a pair of binoculars. When they do this, they learn that the Germans are getting ready to attack their base from the air with gas. The soldiers hurry through the woods to warn their comrades and the villagers of a nearby French town of the impending attack. The men are ambushed by a German soldier who opens fire on them before they can get back to their horses. Fortunately, Stubby trips the American soldier and stops Robert from being shot while Gaston fires back. Sadly, the horses were startled by the gunfire and bolted before the soldiers could catch up to them. Robert commands Stubby to alert the soldiers, as there is not much time left to warn them. Robert then proceeds to show Stubby his gas mask. Stubby doesn't waste any time in running to the front lines of battle and signaling to the lieutenant that a gas attack is coming. The clever lieutenant immediately understands the message and sounds an alarm to alert the troops to the impending attack. Stubby rushes to the nearby French town after informing the soldiers of the gas attack and alerting the locals to wear masks and close their windows. However, Stubby is left alone on the street with no protection as the gas slowly approaches him because all the doors and windows are closed. Thankfully, Robert and Gaston are there in time to save the dog as it is about to run into a nearby barn. The two create a temporary mask out of a wet napkin and put it on Stubby. Fortunately, it works because the gas eventually leaves him unharmed. The grateful villagers emerge from their homes after the vapor has subsided and sincerely thank Stubby for his bravery. That evening, Robert and Gaston took a stroll through the woods and then sat atop a hill to take in the stunning horizon. The two bond over their desire to go home to their families as they discuss their individual wartime experiences. The two men are bonding as they watch the sun go down when the sounds of bombs suddenly interrupt them. When the pair hears this, Stubby joins them as they quickly return to the front lines to join their fellow soldiers. They discover that the Germans have attacked them unexpectedly there. Fortunately, most of the soldiers managed to flee the assault and make it back to camp without incident. Unfortunately, one was killed on the battlefield after being caught in the crossfire and suffering serious injuries. Stubby is devastated by the news and rushes to the tense front lines to look for the wounded soldier. So, going back to the opening scene of the film, following the soldier's recovery, the American and French troops got ready for another round of German assaults. Shortly after, as the enemy troops advanced toward the American trenches, the soldiers fought valiantly to defend their position. A group of German soldiers eventually enters the camp after about an hour of evading their defenses. When Robert and Gaston notice this, they decide to set a trap for the trespassers with Stubby's assistance. The cunning dog draws in the enemy and tempts them to pursue him through the trenches. The unaware German soldiers are ambushed by Robert and Gaston as they circle around, and the men are then forced to surrender by being held at gunpoint. Robert and Stubby hastily return to the front lines after the men are taken into custody. The troops quickly take cover as they are attacked there with a barrage of grenade attacks. A few seconds later, Hans and Olsen are only a few feet away from where an enemy grenade lands. Stubby grabs the grenade and runs away from the American soldiers because the stunned soldiers are unable to quickly avoid the attack. Robert runs after Stubby while screaming in horror at what he sees. Fortunately, he discovers the courageous dog lying under a pile of wood, still alive but in serious condition. Robert, who is instantly terrified, picks up Stubby and brings him to the camp, where he and Hans are immediately taken to a hospital in an ambulance. Back at the front lines, the Germans had finally breached their defenses and taken control of the area, forcing the soldiers to withdraw. Eventually, a dejected Robert finds his friends again, but he must fight alone for the next few months. Even worse, his dependable partner Gaston is transferred to a different platoon, thus increasing his sense of isolation. Unfortunately, Robert's health issues only worsen as the deadly flu that he contracts spreads among the forces. Olsen discovers Robert coughing on a chilly night and rushes him to the nearest hospital. To Olsen's dismay, Robert's condition continues to deteriorate for the next few days as his fever continues to be extremely high. One day, the worried friend hears rustling coming from a bush as he patrols the infirmary's grounds. Olsen looks it over startled and is shocked to see Stubby hiding in the bushes. When Olsen notices this, he immediately takes Stubby to see Robert. Man and dog are reunited moments later as Stubby keeps Robert company while he recovers in the hospital. Fortunately, Robert beats the flu and bounces back to full health. Stubby and Robert go back to the front lines to fight alongside their allies. As usual, Stubby proves to be a valuable asset by assisting the soldiers in finding and eliminating enemy spies. The combined efforts of the American and French armies were successful in forcing the German soldiers to flee, getting the upper hand in the conflict. A few weeks later, Stubby and Robert each receive a promotion after word of their valiant actions reaches higher levels of authority. Robert moves up in rank to corporal from private. Stubby receives the honorary sergeant rank. Gaston returns to camp and meets up with Robert and Stubby during the award ceremony. The following day, the troops arrived at the battleground and took control of yet another German position, forcing their adversaries to make a further retreat. An American soldier enthusiastically declares that the war will end the following day as the Germans are attempting to sign a peace treaty as soon as they take control of this location. The relieved soldiers celebrate the happy news by clapping and tossing their battle helmets. The platoon's lieutenant, however, interrupts the soldiers' celebration to say that the battle won't be over until 11 a.m. the following day. The soldiers' spirits are dampened by this, but they maintain their optimism in light of the impending end of the war. The following morning, the American and French troops launch their final assault on the enemy lines. As the battle intensifies, two German soldiers corner Stubby, Gaston, and Robert while holding each other at gunpoint. Fortunately, things don't get too bloody before 11 a.m. when the war officially ends, thanks to a trumpet. The group is shocked to learn that Olsen passed away during the final battle as they reunite with Hans. As they bow their heads in respect, the men silently lament their fallen comrade. The troops pack their belongings the following week in order to depart for their respective nations. Robert says goodbye to Gaston as the American forces finally make their way back home with a heavy heart. The crowd applauds in appreciation for the returning soldiers as they arrive and are given warm welcomes. Hans and Robert stroll through the streets side by side, and Stubby rides proudly in a car. As a picture of the actual Stubby appears on screen, the film comes to an end with a photographer taking a picture of the military dog. This concludes the recap of animation. Turn on notifications, leave a like to support the channel, and subscribe to see more videos like this one. I appreciate you coming.